coming in.
Oh,
Shall
hello.
I start recording?
Sure. Welcome. Good morning. Magandang umaga. Hello. We're going to get started once we admit everyone in through our virtual front door. Welcome. If you were coming into our house, some of you may remove shoes. Others would be giving hugs and kisses. Welcome in a pre-pandemic time. Good to see everyone. At least that would be the case maybe in my household.
Mine too.
Yeah.
You'd probably be hearing shrill like,
Yes. Hugs, kisses, long time no see.
like I see friends here. Hi, Ramel. Wow.
Oh. Good morning.
Hello,
Good
hello.
morning. Welcome. Thank you for your patience as we're all entering into the foyer, the front door, the side door, the back door. Welcome. We'll get started momentarily. And thank you for your patience as we enter into this space. Good morning, good morning. All right. So I'm going to begin and welcome us in with our CRC, Cosumnes River College land acknowledgement. So we'll just take a moment of reflection. We pause to acknowledge that Cosumnes River College sits on the occupied land that is of Miwok and Nishnawbe people. We remember their continued connection to this region and give thanks to our Miwok and Nishnawbe communities. We offer our respect to their elders and to all Miwok and Nishnawbe people of the past and present. We acknowledge the land acknowledgement and support the continued growth and development of our Indigenous and Native American communities in South Sacramento and Elk Grove. Thank you. And mabuhay and welcome to our Filipino American, Filipinx American History Month inaugural event with our virtual keynote presentation with Dr. Robin Magalit Rodriguez. Round of applause and woohoo! If we were here, we'd be having beverages and food, so please indulge, imbibe, or take up while you're with us this morning. We know that you're here from the Cosumnes River College community, the Los Rios Community College District, our friends from American River College, from Folsom Lake College and Sac City College, Sacramento City College are here. We also have friends from Sacramento State, or CSU, Sac State College, Sac State University, and we know there are friends up and down the West Coast, the East Coast, and in between, here to virtually break bread with us and support Dr. Rodriguez's work. We are so thrilled to have this inaugural Filipino American History Month event, and happy Filipino American History Month to us all. We had over 100 friends, kababayan, kaibigan, mga kaibigan, register with us today, so thank you for joining us. And a hearty magandang umaga sa inyong lahat to all of you. Thank you so much for choosing to spend the morning with us. This morning's event would not be possible if it wasn't for the events coordination team, who you'll get to hear from a little bit this morning. Our friend Paolo Soriano is a counseling faculty with Cosumnes River College and also faculty at Sac State and club faculty advisor for Kasamahan Filipinx Club. I also want to extend thanks and gratitude to my sister Sabrina Sensel, Interim Dean of Equity and Research, as part of our coordination team, and Michael Bittner, who's our digital communications specialist who helped us get set up today to record and live stream if we exceed 300. But we're live streaming anyway, so just to let you know, we are recording and live streaming this morning's event. And also big thank you to our new friend, our kaibigan, Catherine Mercedes Judge, who is the booking coordinator for Dr. Rodriguez. Maraming salamat to the event coordination team, and for all of you who help promote and support this significant event for us today, and to acknowledge our partners at Elk Grove Unified School District, who also adopted with partnership and support with Dr. Rodriguez, the first ever resolution as a school district for October as Filipino American History Month. And I'm sure we will hear more about the local community organizing efforts. So a few housekeeping items to share with you. As I mentioned, we are recording the event. We'll share that out for those that registered, and we'll make that link live for you. We'll also do our best to monitor the chat, and thanks for engaging in the chat and for showing your screen. Please also share your video if you can. Remain muted unless you have a question towards the end, but we want to see your beautiful, lovely faces. We want to know you're with us. Dr. Rodriguez is seeing friends for the first time, maybe that we haven't seen in a long time. So if you can, please share your video and utilize chat. We will do our best to monitor chat for questions, for comments. There will be time at about 12:15 for more Q&A, and we do have a prompt end at 12:30. So we appreciate, within the confines of higher ed, we have an agenda, even though if we were at our homes, we would probably linger into the afternoon, a little siesta, merienda, and then stay for dinner. So here we have to limit it to 90 minutes. So without further ado, I do have a couple brief general announcements to share, and then honored to introduce my esteemed colleague, Paolo Soriano, who's going to introduce Dr. Rodriguez. So for announcements, we want you to know that this is an opportunity today too for not only us to support the important, remarkable, distinguished work of Dr. Rodriguez related to Filipinx American Studies and Asian Am Studies, etc., and the community organizing work here in the greater Sacramento area. We're blessed to have her as a resident here in Elk Grove as well. But this is also an opportunity for us to revitalize the club, Kasamahan Filipinx. So if you're interested in helping to revitalize the student organization, please reach out to Paolo Soriano. His email will be in the chat soon. It's sorianop@crc.losrios.edu. Also, we want to celebrate and highlight that we just got awarded our first individual ANAPISI grant. So we are a minority serving institution. We've already been a Hispanic serving institution designation. We are an Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander designated institution, and we got both grants this last year. We have an HSI grant celebrating Mikasa, who are here on the call with us in solidarity. Mikasa leadership is here. And now we have an inaugural individual grant to support up to 300 Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students recruiting and retaining to complete CRC and go on and transfer. And we became part of a collaborative grant with the entire Los Rios district and Sac State and 2 other districts neighboring us, San Joaquin, Delta, and Sierra district. So we are a regional collaborative and are going to support at CRC and across the district, each of us 25 students to support a pipeline to transfer to Sac State. So we are so thrilled about the capacity building we are engaged in to support Filipinx students and our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander students. Huge win for our region. And lastly, want to say to please save the date, October 22nd. Please join Filipino, Filipinx, Filipina employees of Los Rios Community College for our first virtual Magkita Kits. It's a meetup. We're going to talk topics and talk about how we can leverage PhilAm studies, how to support ANAPISI work, and also other work in our greater Sacramento community. So Mabuhay Filipinx, Mabuhay Filipino American History Month, and Mabuhay CRC. And again, thank you so much for being here. I now turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Paolo Soriano, to introduce our remarkable keynote speaker. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Oliveros. Mabuhay to everyone and magandang umaga sa inyo lahat. I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker today. You already know her name, but I'll go ahead and give you a brief bio, or as brief as it can be, given all of her accomplishments and her achievements in making her the person and the scholar that she is today. But Dr. Robin Rodriguez is a full professor of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Davis. She was the first Pinay to serve as chair in the Asian American Studies Department's 50-year history. She's also the founding director of the Bulasan Center for Filipino Studies, the only one of its kind in the University of California system and nationally focused on the Filipinx experience in the United States. Dr. Rodriguez earned her PhD in sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, one of the world's top-ranked sociology departments. Her graduate studies were supported by the National Science Foundation and the Ford Foundation. After earning her doctorate, she was awarded a postdoctoral fellowship with the Center for Comparative Immigration Studies at UC San Diego, and shortly thereafter, hired as assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Rutgers University. Dr. Rodriguez is a widely published and award-winning scholar, and she's written on global migration with a particular focus on overseas Filipino workers. She's written on Asian American, including Filipinx American issues, highlighting Asian American activism in recent years. She's a highly sought after public speaker, as evidenced today, and has addressed a broad range of audiences around the world. In the last year, she also helped lead the creation of the Sacramento Asian Pacific Islander Regional Network, where they've successfully fought to ensure that the most marginalized of API communities in the region are getting the support they need to fight COVID-19 and to be protected from anti-Asian racism. Though she has achieved many firsts as a Filipina in her profession, she has been committed to ensuring that she will not be the last, and mentorship and community building in academia, particularly for Black, Indigenous women of color, are of vital importance to her. So without further ado, let's give Dr. Rodriguez a lit Los Rios and Sacramento welcome, y'all. Can I ask you all to unmute and just paw and just clap and just scream? So let's unmute ourselves like, woo!
Thank you for being here.
That is lit. Hey, CRC and all the friends. Oh, what a wonderful welcome. Thank you so much to everybody who helped put this together. Ooh, the welcome still keeps going. But thank you so much. It's so lovely to be here with all of you today. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Oliveros, for taking the lead on this. Paulo, Sabrina, of course, so many others who've been responsible. Angela, on our team, thank you so much for being here. So yay, happy Filipino American History Month 2021. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully this works in the way that I'm wanting it to work. Just give me a moment. Good. So everybody sees that, yes? Okay, cool. Now I just have to get my my notes. Okay. I don't know why it like makes it a little hard. Okay, just give me a moment. Sorry. I'm not trying to get you to see my notes.
Oh, Dr. Rodriguez, your slides disappeared.
I know. Just give me a sec. Let's try it again. Let me see. Okay. Do you see me now? Do you see the slides or do you see my notes?
No notes, no slides currently.
Okay. We shall try again. Okay. Does this work?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I didn't mean to go ahead, but it's going further ahead than I intended. So I just want to start here. I just want to make sure that, are you seeing the first slide? Thank you. Right. So the title for today is A Century in the Making, the unfolding history of Filipinos in the Sacramento region. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I picked this particular title. Now, for those of you who don't already know, October is in fact Filipino American History Month. As you can see here, the theme for this year's Filipino American History Month is 50 years since the first Young Filipino People's Far West Convention. And as you see on this slide, in 1971, so 50 years ago, over 300 young Filipino American people gathered in Seattle for the first Young People's Far West Convention. And for 11 years, that's quite a bit of time, 11 years, youth participants met at the FWCs to discuss issues important to them, from identity to the anti-martial law movement, to farm workers' rights, to ethnic studies. The FWCs are considered to be the beginnings of the Filipino-American movement and the impetus for Filipino-American studies. And so for this year, FON, which is the major Filipino organization that really does the work of preserving our history, the Filipino-American National Historical Society, is really encouraging the celebration of the Filipino People's Far West Convention and just of youth empowerment and organizing throughout Filipino-American history. Really, really important about why October. So Filipino-American History Month is celebrated now in October because, and I'll talk about this, but it commemorates the arrival of the first Filipinos who landed in what is now Morro Bay on the Central Coast in California. And that happened on October 18th, 1587. And it's also the birth month of Filipino-American labor leader Larry Itliong. And Larry Itliong was a leader alongside Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, as well as Filipino-American labor leader Philip Veracruz. And together they helped form the United Farm Workers. So I really wanted to just make sure that, people understand, where is this coming from? And I also want to speak to, I'll weave this in, but what's really interesting is this Far West Convention was pretty significant even in the Sacramento region. Many of the important leaders here in Sacramento and the greater region were young people attending the Filipino People's Far West Convention. Some of the people who were responsible for forming what became the FONS, right, the Filipino-American National Historical Society's chapter in Sacramento and the Delta, attended these conferences. Other people who fought for ethnic studies at Sac State, and that is my Zoom background today is from Sac State, is an image of the mural that Filipino Americans had advocated for here in the region, again, to commemorate Filipino American history. So, for those of you who may not realize it, all around us, all throughout the Sacramento region, there are traces of Filipino American history that may not always be known to you. And hopefully with this presentation and also with Elk Grove Unified commemorating or marking October as Filipino American History Month, we can really start to pay more attention to the rich contributions Filipinos have made to this region for over a century. One of the things I want to talk about is the significance of calling it Filipino American History Month as opposed to Filipino American Heritage Month. And here I'm really drawing from my dear, dear friend and colleague, we lost her far too early, the late Dr. Dawn Mabalon, who was who grew up in Stockton, California, and actually went on to write the definitive history of Filipino-American Stockton in her book, Little Manila's in the Heart. So she says this, and this is from a post of hers on social media in 2013. And she makes this very clear. She says, it's not Heritage Month. It's not Philippine Heritage Month. Okay, thanks. This is from a post. And I want to be able to bring that energy for her because she was incredibly funny. For those of us who knew her, she was just so gregarious and just hilarious. And so I hope I'm channeling you, Dawn, not Heritage Month. Okay, thanks. So history, she says, as is stated on this slide, history is inclusive of heritage and culture, but it's also about the ways we've built and changed this nation. Our stories, political struggles, transformations, labor migration, activism, impact of imperialism and war, victories, etc. Whereas heritage is more limited to what we pass down in terms of culture, tradition, legacies. History is inclusive of heritage and much more, whereas heritage isn't inclusive necessarily of history all the time. We made history, we helped build this nation. That's what this month is all about. And again, wanting to foreground that because I have seen the ways in which people have taken, I think, Filipino American History Month out of context, or oftentimes kind of delimit it to a celebration of Philippine culture. It becomes a time when everybody's kind of, celebrating Philippine dance, like the bamboo, stick dance that some of you may know as tinikling, or celebrate eating adobo and pancit or lumpia. Those are things are fantastic things, but really what we're trying to talk about here is history, right? Inclusive of all the things that Dr. Mabalan talks about here in this slide. But before I actually go into history of the region, I actually want you to all to take a moment to reflect on your own family's migration to and settlement in the region. With the exception, of course, of Native peoples who have been caretakers on this land for far, far longer than this country was a country, I really do want you to just take a quick moment. If you have to grab a piece of paper and do this old school and a pencil and paper, or if you want to open up some notes, I really want you to take a moment to reflect about how you came to be here in this place or wherever it may be. But, I'm assuming I'm talking to a lot of people who are kind of in the broad Sacramento region, but even wherever you may be, actually take a moment to think about how did you come to be in the place that you are now. I'm asking you to do this because I'm hoping that by you finding a connection, by you really reflecting on your particular migration story, your settlement story, that somehow you might be able to find a connection between your story and this broader history that I'll paint for you today. I think part of why I invite you to do this is because we do live in a society that is so about the present. I had a colleague call it a presentist society. Right? Everything is about instantaneous news. We have Instagram. It's not histogram, it's Instagram. It's the now. History sometimes is only as far as a Google search may yield, right? You might have to click over 10 times before you can get into a deeper and richer history and get stories beyond the scope of what kind of pops up in a particular search or kind of our feed. So I really want to invite you to take a moment to reflect on your migration and settlement story of your family so that you can find a way to connect to this broader history, because I think that these stories are so valuable to connect with, to value, and to cherish. So just take a moment to do that and just reflect. I'll give you about a minute or so to just think about how you came to be here. And then as we talk and I share with you the Filipino American history of the region, hopefully you can see yourself somehow in relation to it, even if you don't necessarily have roots in the Philippines or connect kind of with that identity. Just take a moment. If you feel so compelled, you could even share it in the chat. Hopefully we'd share the chat. We can save the chat transcripts later, but just take a moment again. What is your story, your history? Okay, let's go. It doesn't seem like anybody's here, but that's okay. Thank you, Janice. I appreciate that. But as you continue to reflect, just keep it in the back of your mind. I'm going to bring Dawn in again. Dawn was so insightful. One of the things she said is this: we have lost much of our community history because of the assumption that our past is not history, that it is not an American experience worthy of interpretation and analysis. To some people, newspapers, community programs, photo albums, documents, etc., were only junk. or at best, someone else's memories rather than history. It's a really, really important quote for Dr. Mabalan, because she really, really tried to, in her work, really bring all of these things, the things that we might think of as junk, someone's memories, bring them together and together weaving all of these stories together, creating the history of Filipino America, in her case, Filipinos in Stockton, but her book really shed light on the Filipino American historical experience in the broader region. And why I title this talk as History in the Making, and that it's unfolding, is because we continue to need to do the work of sharing our stories. And that's actually what we've been doing at the Huelga Archive. And today I'm actually drawing quite a bit from all of the stories we've been able to preserve on the Huelga Archive that's housed at the Bulosan Center. And I do want to note, for those of you who haven't yet had a chance to share your story, in Elk Grove, we are going to be celebrating Filipino American History Month on the 22nd. Hopefully we'll be able to send details to those of you who have an interest in participating, but we want to be able to do like a story share booth over there. So please share your story. But that's what we've been doing at the Huelga Archive. I'll give you a quick history of the Huelga Archive. So in 2013, Assembly Member Rob Bonta, now Attorney General Rob Bonta, introduced the Assembly Bill AB 123. And the bill basically did, as is explained by Assembly Member Bonta in this slide, what the bill did was to supplement California's rich farm worker history with the contributions of the Filipino American community. The Filipino American population composes the largest Asian population in California and continues to grow. Yet the story of Filipinos and the crucial efforts to the farm labor movement is an untold part of California history. Of course, the image that you have also on the slide, in addition to then Assembly Member Bonta testifying in support of AB 123, and he's accompanied by Dolores Huerta, who is probably better known as a labor leader of the United Farm Workers Movement, or the Farm Workers Movement. And they were there to support the passage of this law that really mandates that now, in the teaching of the farm worker history in California's public schools, that at least the contributions of the Filipino American community also be part of it, which includes the story of Larry Itliong. So we created the Huelga Archive because the sad truth, and it was really, really, really tragic that we lost Dr. Don Mabalan. The sad truth is, though it's been over 50 years, the Filipinos had actually been incredibly active in organizing farm workers practically since the time they landed in the 1930s to work in the fields throughout the Delta, throughout this region. Despite all of the work that they had done over decades, experience they brought into the organizing in the 1960s that eventually led to the creation of the United Farm Workers, for which Cesar Chavez is very well known, as well as Dolores Huerta. There have been countless books on the United Farm Workers, countless books on Cesar Chavez, but we have yet to see a scholarly text on Larry Itliong and his contribution. Dr. Don Mabalan was in the midst of writing that and finishing that when she died tragically in 2018. We're fortunate enough to have an illustrated book that she co-wrote with Gail Romasanta, also a Stockton native, which at least captures some of the research that that Dr. Mabalan was able to do. But part of what's kind of the tragedy is that though Assembly Member Bonta, again now Attorney General Bonta, was able to get this law passed, even though it's a mandate, we have very little to draw from. If teachers wanted to teach Filipino American contributions to the farm worker struggle, if we hadn't really done some of this work of trying to create this archive, which we did, they would be hard pressed to find books out there. And so what we did was to try to collect oral histories as fast as we could before people passed, to try to collect documents before people chuck them into the recycling bin, to try as much as possible to recreate and get kind of the material together to help support the writing of the histories of Filipinos' contributions to the farm worker struggle. So, I think it was dropped in the chat, but, if you're interested, you'll see that I'll talk a lot about some of the collections in our archive and draw from them. But I thought it was just important for everybody to kind of just understand some of the backstory. Again, our history is unfolding. We still have a lot of work to do. Again, Larry Itliong and many, many other labor leaders did so much that has yet to be fully accounted for in books. There's still an unfolding history of contributions of Filipinos in the region even now. So without further ado, let me go into it. Again, drawing from Dr. Mabalon, one of our, really few Filipino-American historians. Although part of what we're also doing at the Bulosan Center is trying to mentor the next generation of Filipino-American historians. But Dr. Don Mabalon offered this really, really great framework for thinking about the Filipino immigration to the United States. And she delineates, or she identifies these 7 major waves of Filipino immigration. And it encompasses more than a century of Filipino settlement in the US. I'll try to power through all of them because I want to be able to really anchor or bring in the experiences of Filipinos in this region in particular when I go through each of the waves. But these are the 7 waves of Filipino immigration that I really still feel that I feel are really, really great for helping us to think about Filipino migration broadly to the United States, also specifically to the region. So there's, again, these seven periods. So the first is the seafarers, slaves, and shipbuilders, and that starts from 1587 to 1898. The second is war, imperialism, and the pensionado, 1898 to 1906. The third is sacadas and adventurers, 1906 to 1934. The fourth is the exclusion period, war and the second generation, 1934 to 1946. Post-war changes and Navy families, that's the fifth wave, 1946 to 1965. The sixth wave is post-65 immigrants, 1965 to 1986, and the seventh, which is Filipinos in the diaspora, 1986 to the present. So hopefully folks did the little or accepted my invitation to take pause and think about their own family's migration and settlement, whatever it may be, whether your roots are in the Philippines or elsewhere. And perhaps you can already begin to map your own migration story against this historical timeline to think, if you're not Filipino, what your connection or your family's connection might be to the Filipino-American experience. And if you are Filipino, to be able to map your personal experience onto the collective experience of our community as a whole in the United States and in the region. Before, though, I go on into each of these periods of time, it's really important to have an analytic framework for thinking about when, why, and how Filipinos migrated and settled in the country, right? I don't want you to just kind of to throw out a whole string of facts that you're not able to frame more within a kind of a framework that at least I think is important within a critical ethnic studies lens, which is what I bring to the table whenever I teach the Filipinx or Filipino experience in America. It's really, really important to understand and place Filipinos' migration within the broader context of the United States imperatives as a racial capitalist country. I draw very much from Black Studies scholars here in their definitions of racial capitalism, or their definitions of the US as a racial capitalist society. Black Studies scholar Robin Kelly says that racial capitalism is a system dependent on slavery, on violence, imperialism, and genocide. And, again, we cannot understand Filipinos' migration if we cannot place it within the context of the fact that the US is a racial capitalist society. And, as I mentioned earlier, I don't want us to just look at these various facts without having a framework for making sense of their various historical facts that you'll encounter over the course of this presentation. So let's just move on just to understand early Filipino migration. You have to understand the United States development as a settler colonial. And when we say settler colonial, it is about the fact that what we now occupy, and we started this presentation with a land acknowledgement. Thankfully, that's something that people are doing in very recent years now, but we know that the land on which we sit here was land, is continuous in many cases because it's contested in some places, but continues to be connected to Native peoples, that the Native peoples were forcibly displaced as a consequence of white settler colonialism. Racial capitalist society, this racial capitalist society in America required the dispossession and genocide of Native peoples. It required Blacks' labor first as enslaved workers or enslaved laborers, and then as poorly paid workers. And then later, the United States would turn to other sources of labor, especially after the post-Civil War period. And this is sort of a classic image that is depicted of Chinese laborers who were among the first laborers from Asia who were actively recruited to work in the United States. And for those of you who are in the region, there's a bit of their history in the Railroad Museum and the Train Museum in Sacramento. But to understand why the Chinese, you kind of, again, have to understand it within the context too of the post-emancipation period or after the Civil War. So after the Civil War, it meant that the United States could not depend anymore on enslaved labor, right? By then, the Civil War ended. Slavery formally in the United States. And so among the things that employers did was try to source other forms of cheap laborers to fulfill certain kinds of labor demands. And employers looked to Asia first for workers. Hence, you see Chinese workers being among the first workers being recruited to work in the United States, especially after the post-Civil War period. And so for those of you who are, who might be rusty with your history, so the Civil War ended in 1865. So just knowing that kind of this is where the beginnings of Asian migration happen is in the period after that, in the late 19th century, and Filipino migration comes along with or after different sources of labor come in from other parts of Asia. And I'll explain a little bit to you as to why the US went across different countries of Asia for workers. One of the things about US immigration policy is it's always been shaped by this paradox or this kind of contradiction. So of racial capitalist demand on one hand, but also very white supremacist ideas related to labor competition and citizenship. Another way I like to think about it is they wanted Asians as workers, but did not want them as people to settle and live in the country. Right? Only wanted them as workers and their labor, but ultimately did not want them as people who could settle and be here. And this was especially true. Of course, we could see the remnants until today of anti-Asian hate and discrimination even now. Well, some of the origins of that you could trace all the way back to the late 19th century. But so the US immigration always had this kind of paradox, right? Labor demand on one hand, and yet this pushback against racialized workers. And so though after the Civil War, the United States US employers were really trying to find other sources of cheap labor. They went to China, and yet there was then a pushback against Chinese immigration. And so after the Chinese, with all the pushback and anti-Asian or anti-Chinese sentiment that then led to laws restricting Chinese immigration, and then the US went to then recruit from Japan. the Japanese workers would also then be targeted by anti-Asian sentiment and sometimes even violence. That then also led to anti-Japanese immigration exclusion. And then eventually then they turned to the Philippines, as I'll explain in a bit. But so the anti-Asian sentiment, really what that is the negative attributes that are often ascribed to those who are racialized non-white, which combine them to low wage, low status work. There was this whole yellow peril stereotype that emerged. You could see it in all these images, like this kind of menacing figure of what's supposed to be a Chinese worker. This is the kind of stereotype that was kind of propagated and reproduced in the late 19th century, not unlike, of course, the kind of anti-Asian sentiment that was also propagated with the rise of COVID, with notions of the Wuhan flu. White supremacist nativist forces often called for the end of different kinds of migration of different Asian workers. And just to kind of recap some of the laws that were instituted, first you see some of the recruitment of Asian workers coming in to complete the transcontinental railroad within years after the end of the Civil War. Then you start to see successive acts prohibiting the migration of Asians. First was the 1875 Page Law, which actually prohibited the migration of Asian women, specifically Chinese women, because that was the women were migrating from China in the main at the time. Then there was a Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and then the Gentleman's Agreement, which stopped Japanese migration in 1907. Really interesting, I don't know, not so fun fact, but McClatchy, V.S. McClatchy, if you're all familiar with the Sacramento Bee newspaper, V.S. McClatchy, the owner of the Sacramento Bee, a newspaper publisher, was among the very active anti-Asian activists during this time in the late 19th century. He became a very leading figure, leading the efforts to stop Asian migration from China and then from Japan. I'm not going to be able to kind of rehash this broader context, really, again, trying to place all of the different 7 periods of Filipino migration to the United States within this broader context of this framework of racial capitalism. I do invite you, there's a really, really great timeline that was produced by a partnership between Asian American Studies scholars and Asian American advocates called A Different Asian American Timeline, and it's been added in the chat. Thank you, Angela, my assistant, who's been sharing it in the chat. Fantastic resource, because if you want to revisit later some of the 7 periods of time that I talk about here, but then really look at it in connection to other communities of color, in connection to settler colonialism that's ongoing, and the dispossession and genocide of Native peoples that's all also happening in the backdrop of Filipino migration, to the continued struggles of Black people in America, to other connections to Latinx and communities. You can see all of that really nicely laid out in this timeline, because I'm not going to be able to do that fully here. But again, it's not sufficient to just know a bunch of facts like, yay, Filipinos landed in Morro Bay in this year, or Filipinos are, numerous in this place. For, these facts are not meaningful if we can't also provide a frame for them. And again, for me, at least, the frame has to be one rooted in a critical ethnic studies lens, which means necessarily that you have to look at Filipino migration from the framework of racial capitalism in the United States. So let's begin with the waves. We're already so deep into this conversation, and I haven't even gone to the first wave, but the first wave was 1587 to 1898. The seafarers, slaves, and shipbuilders. So for those who don't know, that's why my last name, by the way, is Rodriguez, in case you were confused. A Spanish last name for a person who looks like me, because the Philippines had been colonized by the Spanish for several centuries. But prior to the colonization of the Philippines in 1565, the peoples of the archipelago were very varied in history and culture, and weren't really were without a central government. But the beginnings of Filipino global migration and their presence in North, or what we're now calling North America, is connected to this history of colonization. So the Spanish galleon trade across the Pacific depended on labor, of course. They depended on seafarers, depended on shipbuilders, even on slaves. There's actually more recent historical studies that have shed more light on the trans-Pacific slave trade, as many people are more familiar perhaps with the transatlantic slave trade, but there was in fact also a trans-Pacific slave trade. And so the presence of Filipinos in the very beginning in that first wave is attributed to Spanish colonialism. The first notable landing of Filipinos was on the shores of what is now called Morro Bay in 1587. They were crew members aboard a galleon ship, jumped ship and decided, well, in this case, they landed there. And so just their presence was at this time. If you go to Morro Bay, you'll see a plaque there that the Filipino American National Historical Society was able to get installed there. There's actually another notable settlement of Filipinos that is documented that's fairly early, and that's in Louisiana in 1763 in a place called St. Malo. They too had arrived by on Spanish ships. Most accounts suggest that they were laboring on Spanish trading vessels when they decided to settle in, of course, what is now the United States. There's evidence that suggests that they intermarried with Native women, with Black women as well in Louisiana. What's really, really interesting is there's actually a group in Louisiana of Filipinos who descend from these earlier migrants who continue to preserve the history of the settlement there. Unfortunately, climate change linked to really the destructive nature too of the oil industry in Louisiana has nearly wiped St. Malo from existence, but there are people doing the work of preserving that history. The United States replaced the Spanish colonizers after they defeated the Philippine independence movement. So the Filipinos were actually in a very successful revolutionary movement against the Spanish. I'm always very proud to say I am a descendant of a Filipino anti-colonial revolutionaries. It's in our blood. We were very successful at throwing off the yoke of Spanish colonialism. We thought that Americans, or Filipinos thought that the Americans might be allies in their fight against the Spanish, because the United States has its own anti-colonial history in its fight for independence from the Britain. Filipino revolutionaries learned quickly that what they thought was an ally was in fact just a new colonizer. And so the United States did become colonized the Philippines in 1898. And you know, colonization in the Philippines was incredibly brutal. Again, the Filipinos had been fighting successfully first against Spanish colonization, and when they realized that the United States was going to move in to replace the Spanish as colonizers, were fought pretty bravely and valiantly also against Spanish colonization. And that really, against American colonization. As with any kind of war, the Filipinos had been at war for many years. By then, by the time the Americans had come in, it was incredibly devastating on the Filipino people. And that became, that then serves as the backdrop for why we then have massive migration from the Philippines starting in the early 1900s into the 1930s. So let me just draw from a quote from Carlos Bulosan. So Carlos Bulosan, I highly recommend this book, America is in the Heart. Totally transformed my life. Writer Carlos Bulosan, after whom the center that we founded at UC Davis is named, was a writer. He was also a migrant worker. He was writing, he wrote this novel in the 1940s. Really, really changed my own life. And America's in the Heart, it's a novel, so it's a fictionalized account, but very, very much rooted in the actual experiences of Filipino migrants in the early decades of the 20th century. We named our center after him because we want to do what he did, which is to use our research and our writing as a way of uplifting the most marginalized in our communities, which he did. And I just want to read from the novel because I think it's helpful for understanding what was happening in the Philippines, such that there was such pressure to come to the United States in the early parts of the 20th century. So he writes this on page 23 of his novel. We had no more land except the narrow strip of ground where our hut stood, and the lot where our hut stood, and the lot where my father had built a house for my brother Leon and his wife. I mean, it's kind of out of context, but in the novel, he really talks about how the land holdings of his family is just kind of reduced significantly over time, and that really putting pressure on his family. He also just discusses the kind of wealth that's happening with the colonization of the Philippines by the Americans. The wealth that was not already in the power of the large corporations, banks and the church was beginning to flow in the vaults of new corporations, banks, and other groups. As bloodily as this wealth concentrated into the hands of new companies, as swiftly did the peasants and workers become poorer. Again, he really captures what is shifting and kind of made worse and exacerbated by the colonization of the Philippines by the United States after Spanish colonization. Just he describes this episode of his father trying to seek justice at the court. And he describes it this way: he had no money, and the wise men at the court spoke to him in Spanish and English. What could a poor, ignorant peasant like my father do in an organization such as the provincial government of Pangasinan? So these kind of episodes are really, really important for, I think these episodes from the novel, I think provide really, really great, rich description of what it felt like for Filipinos during the American colonial experience. Why then that created some of the displacement that would later lead to mass migration. And arguably, so many of these episodes, right, that he's writing about in 1946 that formed the backdrop of early migration of Filipinos to the United States in the early 20th century can still be, is still a reason for why Filipinos still feel compelled to migrate today. So later on, I'll talk about, there's some youth that are doing an intensive a discussion of kind of Philippine history and the long-lasting legacies of imperialism and colonialism in the Philippines to this day, this weekend, or in a couple of weekends. I'll share that later. But, again, as Bulosan describes in his novel, those who survived the American War, the Phil-Am War, were often left with very little land and consequently little food, without livestock, without homes, barely with homes. And this is the kind of condition that then, when they were later given the opportunity to do so, that Filipinos would migrate from the Philippines to the US for employment. Because, of course, on the other side of the Pacific, here in the United States and in its territory in Hawaii, again, right, just going back to that initial conversation I had with all of you about the broader context of racial capitalism in the United States, the U.S. economy was growing, right? The Civil War had concluded. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed. The country was united in a new kind of way. The economy was booming. It was really poised to be a global power now. In fact, not only colonized the Philippines and the Pacific, but also colonized Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Atlantic. So really, the United States is kind of emerging as a kind of global power, and that requires new kinds of demand for labor, at least in agriculture. Again, as I talked about, the U.S. first went to China for recruiting workers. There was an anti-Chinese push, which led to their exclusion. They then went to Japan, and there was an anti-Japanese push. Well, then the Philippines became a third major potential source for workers, and an incredibly convenient source, because in the case of the Philippines was now a colony of the United States. So technically, the U.S. had jurisdiction over the Philippines. The Philippines wasn't supposed, a foreign country. It was kind of, an extension, if you will, of the United States. The U.S. didn't want to give Filipino citizenship because, even though the U.S. had colonized the Philippines, they couldn't quite extend citizenship to Filipinos in the Philippines, but they said, there are nationals. And so they kind of still belong and are connected to us. And it's because of Philippine status as nationals that they then were able to be recruited fairly easily to the United States, despite some of these other kind of exclusions. So what happened? Well, first, the US after really brutally suppressing the Philippine-American War, really brutally suppressing the Philippines' anti-colonial movement against the United States, it then introduced this policy of so-called benevolent assimilation. So it's like, really, really ensured that the resistance was dead. And then in its place, then started to introduce a bunch of measures to try to now win the hearts and minds of Filipinos. And so what they did was they expanded public education in the Philippines. And among the things that it also did is that it took elite members of elite families in the Philippines and decided to bring them over to the United States to give them an American-styled education. These people were called pensionados, mainly men, although there were some women as well. The idea was the elite families of the Philippines, if they could have their hearts and minds won over, if they're trained in American ways, they could be helpful in the United States colonization of the Philippines, right? So they're kind of putting a brown face to American colonization in the Philippines. And that's really the beginnings of Filipino migration here. The first kind of decade of the 20th century was of these pensionados. But soon enough, word went back, Filipinos kind of hearing that, there might be educational opportunities in the United States. And so others would try to make their way to the US for schooling, but they weren't necessarily sponsored by the government. And so you see here in 1903, there's initially this first, 100 who were brought in and were sponsored. And then by 1910 to 1938, we've got up to 14,000 who now are kind of coming on their own. And again, that's kind of that constitutes, the initial second wave of Filipino migration. The third major wave, and that's probably the most significant wave for really the settlement of Filipinos, the migration and settlement of Filipinos here in the region, in the greater Sacramento region, is this wave, the 1906 to 1934 wave of the Sacadas and the adventurers, using again Dr. Mabalon's timeline. So in terms of work, you see in 1906 is the beginnings of the recruitment of workers, first in Hawaii, in the United States territory of Hawaii. These workers were called Sacadas, and they were really brought in to work in Hawaii's sugar industry. If you were paying attention before, and when I was talking about the anti-Asian exclusion laws, you might remember that there was the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement, and that was the agreement that led to the end of Japanese migration to the United States. Well, in anticipation that was going to happen, the planters in Hawaii, sugar plantation owners, kind of knew that something could be on the horizon and that might limit their importation of Japanese workers. So, again, if those of you, everybody seems to be going to Hawaii lately. I've been seeing all these posts, but if you're always surprised, like, whoa, there's so many Asians here in Hawaii, why are they here? Well, here's part of the history, right? That the Japanese were among the groups really brought in, aggressively recruited to work in Hawaii. When the Gentlemen's Agreement ended that, then the Hawaiian Sugar Planters Association went to the Philippines as a convenient source of workers, because the Philippines was a colony, Filipinos were considered nationals. And then you see the beginnings of this migration to Hawaii, with nearly 30,000 arriving in Hawaii between 1907 to 1919, and then yet another kind of almost 30,000 coming in by 1920 and 1924. Through the 1920s, many of the tens of thousands of Filipinos would migrate here on the Pacific coast. Some of them would come by way of Hawaii. Some would come directly to California. Most of these were very, very young men, usually under the age of 30, often with very little education. For those who worked in the urban areas, who settled in the urban areas, they often worked in restaurants, hotels, in private homes as low-wage service workers. In rural areas, they were workers, they were migrant workers or seasonal workers. So they basically migrated to where the jobs were from all across the state of California, and even sometimes all the way up to work in the salmon canneries in Alaska. By the 1930s, by 1930, there were about 30,000 Filipinos in California already. 10,000 of them were in Stockton because it was a major agricultural center. And then the rest of the Filipino population was sort of spread out throughout here in the Delta. Ryer Island, Rio Vista, Locke, Isleton, Walnut Grove, even Elk Grove. So I invite you, for those of you who are CRC students, it's not that far from you to kind of go over and get really close to go to these towns. But, this is where early Filipino migrants had settled all throughout the Delta region. So I want to just kind of read this real quick excerpt from one of the papers that's in our Huelga archive that kind of describes what life was like for these young Filipino men who were coming and migrating and settling here in the region. In the 1920s, a one-way fare in the steerage section cost approximately $100. And that was about all that Pinoys could afford. Visiting exotic ports like Hong Kong, Shanghai, Kobe, and Yokohama added excitement to their voyage. But fear set in when contagious diseases spread through the boat. Often the steerage section had the heaviest toll. Pneumonia and meningitis were two common diseases that affected the Filipino travelers. They would often arrive in San Francisco and be quarantined in Angel Island. And once Pinoy landed, of course, their first objective was to try to first see the big city. So they would kind of go and hang out in San Francisco. And then eventually they would make their way to Sacramento, taking a train, or even apparently there were these Filipino taxi cabs that kind of took them from San Francisco to Sacramento, and then even to Stockton. What a lot of the men were doing here was they were working as asparagus cutters. And then after the harvest, they often went to asparagus canneries. Again, some of these remnants, you can still see some of the old factories around the Delta if you go there. Asparagus had been introduced to the region in 1894. And then so, all these kind of factories or these canneries were erected too. I mean, you have to remember, right? For those of you, who may not realize this, right? Refrigeration only gets introduced later. So at this time, the reason why there were so many canneries is because, you couldn't always eat fresh vegetables, but vegetables needed to kind of be canned. And so that's why the workers would kind of go from picking vegetables, in this case around here, vegetable asparagus, then they would go to the canneries. But if you understand crop cycles, right? Once you're done harvesting, well, first of all across California, the harvest is different for different types of fruits and vegetables because, the weather is different across the state. And so people would kind of migrate, from farm to farm, from crop to crop, all the way up California. And so oftentimes they lived in these camps. They lived in these temporary shelters, and these shelters were all around in San Joaquin, Sacramento, Solano, Sutter, Yolo County, and even Contra Costa County. All around these counties, there was almost 400 farm labor housing camps. Of course, we still are an agricultural state. Let's not pretend. Not forget that there continue to be people who do this work. In the main, we know a lot of Mexican workers are doing this work. But in the recent research I've been doing with the Huelga Project, we are talking to Filipinos who are still doing migrant worker, just like this, farm labor, just like this, in the Central Valley. And I'll talk, there's a big event actually later on this month that I would invite some of you guys to attend so that you can kind of see what's happening there. So, this is kind of in the main what really brought a lot of Filipinos to this area. A lot of Filipinos also came through the colonial period because of the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy recruited Filipino workers as stewards and mess boys. I think I saw in the chat somebody talking about having a military connection. Not uncommon for many of us in the Filipino community because of the colonial relationship, right? Again, I'm just reminding you, right? There's this dynamic to immigration policy in the United States. So on one hand, there's sort of demand for racialized workers, and then there's been this pushback. And Filipinos certainly experienced a lot of pushback. I always say that, it was frightening to live as a Filipino in 1930, in 1930s California. As Carlos Bulosan said, I came to know afterward, in many ways, it was a crime to be a Filipino in California. That's how much vitriol and violence Filipinos had to deal with. 1930, of course, is the year after the Great Depression. So that's also partly what's kind of pushing back on kind of anti-Filipino sentiment. I'm not going to be able to kind of talk about it at length, but, I want to share a really great a short documentary that our filmmaker connected to the Bulosan Center, Glenn Aquino, did. It's a 5-minute short about an anti-Filipino riot that happened in Exeter, California. It's in the chat for you to be able to look at some other time. And again, just interesting notes about local leaders and what they did. Again, speaking about McClatchy. McClatchy, the owner of the Sacramento Bee, actually helped the Sacramento City Council. Sac City Council adopted a resolution supporting Filipino exclusion. Other different kinds of organizations are really active in fighting for anti-Filipino exclusion. There are lots of reasons for the anti-Filipino sentiment. Obviously, there was the anti-Asian sentiment that was already out there. Filipinos seem to attract especially kind of the ire of many white supremacists because Filipinos knew some English, were somewhat cognizant of kind of American culture because they had been colonized by the Americans and had been introduced to American culture and education, and could interact with white women, did interact with white women because there weren't as many Filipinas at the time. That also kind of incited some of this pushback against Filipinos. Oops, I'm not going to show this, sorry. Although it's a really cool documentary to watch. Once the exclusion of Filipinos was successful in 1934, there was actually a campaign to expel Filipinos. So the federal government actually set aside money, and they were trying to basically, pay Filipinos off to leave. It wasn't very successful, but there was an actual attempt to expel Filipinos actively by 1935. And that was with the Repatriation Act of 1935. Filipinos, though they were really, really exploited on the fields, they were also organizing. And Filipino organizing in the fields pretty much started as soon as they started working on the fields. Filipinos organizing together, often across ethnic groups, which is already important because so many of them didn't always think of themselves as Filipinos, because so many Filipinos had very, very strong regional identities, and yet there is a way that they would come across ethnic lines in the fields. They would also then unite with other Asian ethnic groups, and they fought pretty militantly as workers in the fields. They were able to gain wage increases and some other kind of rights. really big strike that happened in the area by the 1940s was the asparagus strike of Stockton, led by the ILWU, Local 37. Really, really important moment of Filipinos kind of coming together, and that this becomes some of the backdrop too for why you have Larry. In fact, Larry Itliong was a leader in this strike. This is where Larry Itliong really starts to learn how to be an organizer in 1948, such that almost 20 years later in 1965 in Delano, when he meets Cesar Chavez, he brings all of that labor organizing experience with him, and they're able to successfully go on strike together with Mexican farm workers later on in the 1960s. There were laws, though, prohibiting the coupling of Filipinos and white women. There were what are called anti-miscegenation laws. It was illegal for Filipinos to marry white women in California. But, it's been great. We've been collecting stories of Filipinos, third generation Filipinos here. In fact, one of the people who helped to get the Filipino American History Month resolution passed by the Elk Grove Unified School District, his grandparents were a Filipino man and a white woman who had to go out of state to get married. And they ended up coming back here and settling and having a family. And so, despite the laws prohibiting it, Filipinos did try to create families with white women, with Native women, with Black women, which is why you have kind of third generation Filipinos who are of mixed race. Sacramento, again, I'm watching the time here. Gosh, so many stories to tell, but Sacramento had a thriving little Filipino town. There were Filipino businesses in downtown Sac that have since gone, but there's a real history there that's really significant of Filipinos, not just kind of working in the fields, but even opening up businesses in Sacramento. Here's a really great photo of downtown Little Manila and Stockton. I haven't yet been able to find any photos of the little Filipino town in Sacramento. If any of you have them in your homes, look under your beds, in your closets, and the storage units, please contribute them to the archives so we can reconstruct this history. There was a Filipino Federation of America. There was a chapter that was established here in the Sacramento region in the 1920s. The Filipino community of Sacramento and vicinity was actually established in 1929 here in Sacramento. Is still going strong. We'll actually be celebrating its Filipino American History Month activities on October 16th. So there was also a fourth wave of Filipino migrants. By 1934, the anti-Filipino sentiment was very successful, as I explained. Filipinos were excluded, but there was some people who were able to come to the United States in that period during the war. During the war, not too long after the Filipinos were not just excluded, but there was a process to try to expel them. During the war, all of a sudden the views towards Filipinos shifted a little bit. The Japanese had occupied the Philippines. Filipinos were joining in the anti-Japanese occupation movement. Many Filipinos here joined the military. So things shifted a bit. People we talked to from the region, local leaders like Dick Maison or Jay Pollard. These are people who are important figures now in the Filipino community, who kind of, some of them have these connections to the military, having come through the military through their parents. Again, I'm just noticing the time. I get so caught up in these stories that I miss out on time. There was a kind of fifth wave in 1946 after the war. You had Filipino Filipinos who had been working in the fields, and when they kind of got enlisted in the military, they went to the Philippines and went to find wives, and they were able to bring back their wives and settle in the Sacramento region. Again, so many institutions were established. There's still the American Legion, I think is in the next slide you'll see here. I'm going to kind of go through that quickly, but there is, I thought there was a slide here. Where did I put the American Legion? Sorry, guys. Oh, there it is. So there was this, it's still around. This is the American Legion Magellan Post of 604 on Gerber Road. But, you know, a lot of Filipinos had joined up in the military, did come back with their families. This was a fixture for Filipino American life from the 1950s and actually even to today, as Filipino veterans gathered here in this hall and had lots of kind of important life events celebrated here. I mentioned before just about kind of Filipinos in the fields and their really kind of militant labor organizing efforts. You know, this is just an oral history from a half Filipina, half Mexican woman who also ended up becoming a labor organizer for the farm worker struggle, who talks about the ways that Filipinos were often pitted against other ethnic groups. Yet by 1965, you know, you have the Delano grape strike and the coming together of Filipinos with Mexicans. Again, I'm not going to be able to talk at length there. But a sixth wave is from 1965 and on, where you really have the immigration law is changing. 1965 is when all of the racist exclusions in immigration law are dropped. And when actually the United States starts to favor not just kind of low wage workers, but they really try to recruit professional workers, especially professional workers in the STEM fields or health fields. My own migration story happens here. My mom is on here. I can see her. Hi, Mom, watching this. She was a nurse, and her migration was a consequence of the change of the 1965 Immigration Act. And it's also what explains a lot of the migration here. Some of the stories I could tell you just about what it was like here in the region. So a lot of Filipino nurses were recruited to work here in the area and work in the hospitals in Sacramento. But some of them were settling in Stockton, where it might have been more affordable and where there was a critical mass of Filipinos. Well, in the 60s and even recently, Filipinos describe stories of how of having to deal with really kind of anti-Filipino kind of racist sentiment coming through Elk Grove. There's even a story of the KKK being active here in the Elk Grove area, and that there was a murder of a young Filipino girl. Their home was burned down by the KKK. Nobody ever investigated it. None of the authorities investigated it. Kind of still an unsolved mystery, but the lore or just the stories among Filipinos is that it was in fact, you know, connected to the KKK. So there was this whole real history backdrop here of Filipinos also trying to survive in a place where there was a lot of continued hostility, a hostility that really continued only until really the 2000s, when things started to shift a little bit here in Elk Grove with new housing developments. I just want to point out, you know, so many wonderful things that were happening kind of in the 60s by the now second generation. So some of the children of those migrants who had come from earlier decades were doing amazing things, whether you have pictures here. There's Albert Balingit, who was a UC Davis law student, an activist who fought for ethnic studies, who was among the people who helped create the department that hired me at Asian American Studies. The reason why we have this beautiful mural is also linked to this earlier histories of people who were fighting for ethnic studies and Filipino studies. The community was able to even erect this center, the Jose Rizal Center. There's a sad story there because it was the communities for a while jointly kind of managed with the city government, and soon enough the community wasn't able to continue to administer the center. There's an ongoing struggle to build an autonomous Filipino center, but there are all of these efforts in the community that led to institutions that we continue to benefit from even to this day. And there's the seventh kind of wave of migration, which is really from 1986 to the present. I have a really great picture here of Megan Sapigal, who's also a local Filipino American leader. Her grandparents had come from the Philippines to work and settle here in the area. Her father was born here in the 1950s, and was married her mother. And she grew up here as a biracial Pinay, and also has lots of stories too about what it was like to grow up as a biracial Filipina in this area, and how things have changed since she was born. But I just wanted to kind of just end off because we don't have too much time, but there's so much amazing work happening in the Filipino community in the last 20 years and even before, of different organizations responding to, for instance, Black Lives Matter, and trying to show up and be in solidarity with the Black community. Also because our community is biracial. We have a lot of Filipino Black community members. There's all these organizations that are working right now here in the region. Hopefully we see a revitalization too of the Filipino Club at CRC. Just to kind of put it out there, if you want to learn more, gosh, I can go into this for hours, as is clear today. But if you want to learn more, I am offering a free webinar series of a course that I'll actually be launching for the community, and some of the links are there. And I also want to just encourage, I had a tragic loss last year of my son, who died in the Philippines while working with Filipino indigenous groups. This month, as Filipino American History Month, is supposed to be a celebration of youth organizers or youth activists. A motto in his life of 22 years, he took on many of the issues that were meaningful to the people who convened the Far West Convention in 1971. He continued to fight for ethnic studies. He fought against gentrification, and then also fought against rising tyranny in the Philippines, and then later ended up wanting to live and work with indigenous communities, where he ended up passing last year. So, please, there's a way to kind of continue to learn about not just Filipino activism, but also the activism that was inspiring to him through that. But I don't have very much time. Oh, it's too many things to talk about. It's 5 minutes only for Q&A, but perhaps, hopefully I'll be able to see folks again. There's so many events I'm going to be at over the next few weeks. Please do. I think there's a way to sign up because we're still in the process. There it is. So there's a couple of these events just to highlight. There's even more. I don't have all the flyers here, but please stay updated, because we just got again, after over a century of being in the region, Elk Grove Unified School District and Elk Grove City Council, and I think the Casumnas District, they're all going to officially recognize Philam History Month. So we have yet to announce everything that'll be happening in the town. So please follow up with updates. Again, this is an unfolding history. All of you have stories to tell that I hope you do tell. Please look at our website, the Blue Sun Center website. There's a way to even submit your story through our Welga archive, but we don't have much time. But if you do have questions in the 4 minutes that we have, please ask them. If not, hopefully I get to encounter you again at any of these numerous events or at future webinars that I'll be offering. But thank you. I hope I was able to bring alive this beautiful history. Oh yes, can you send out the links in a follow-up email? Yes, if I can maybe get the sign-in sheets or the registration from the CRC folks, I'd love to follow up with a list of things for everybody. Thank you, Ramel, who was my date to the prom. Deacon Ramel put us on blast, was my buddy in high school when we were not living here, but living in the Bay Area. We had a great time, both in leadership at the school. But again, if there's any questions, please ask them. I hope thank you for the affirmations. Hope it was informative, engaging. Really excited to be able to answer any questions while we have them. But I think that you guys are supposed to close off, right? CRC team. Sorry.
Yes, we just want to thank you and unmute and give a round of applause to you. Standing ovation. Dr. Rodriguez, thank you so much. Bravo. Thank you for all of the comprehensive history and framework for understanding Filipinx American history. That framework around colonialism and capitalism is so important for us as we think about past, present, and future for our unfolding history of Filipinx in the greater Sacramento area. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. We will share out information, of course, with you, Dr. Rodriguez, but others that want the link to the recording. So thank you again. Round of applause. Thank you to the events coordinator team. Thank you all for taking time out to be with us this morning and hearing this really remarkable and thought-provoking presentation. We will also stay in touch with Dr. Rodriguez, so be on the lookout for more opportunities for us to engage with you and her as well. I'm so glad that your family's here. Manang Daisy Rodriguez, so glad that you're here joining us this morning as well. And you know, we didn't see any questions in the chat, but you do know how to find Robin if you want to connect with her, Dr. Rodriguez, and take one of her classes, get her books, a booking if you want to come to future events. There's lots of ways to engage, and hoping that you'll also help revitalize the Kasamahan Filipinx student organization. So
Yes, I hope to see that, CRC. If we can support anything.
yes, we'll bring you back to maybe give a talk or workshop with our students. I think that would be really great. Don't you think, Paolo? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Any other closing thoughts, Paolo, Sabrina? Thoughts? Or if there are no...
Gratitude for kicking us off on our inaugural celebration and recognition, especially at CRC. So much. So very grateful. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez.
Yes, many thanks. Many thanks over. Thank you.
Yes, well, again, to everyone, a wholeheartedly maraming salamat po. We really appreciate you being with us this morning, and we'll stick around for a few minutes, but that really does conclude the formal part of our program, and so delighted you could be with us for this historic moment for Casamnes River College's Filipino community and community at large. We really appreciate you joining us. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Hey, Robin, I just wanted to say hi real quick.
I saw you, Belinda.